So I had somebody send in an article on the 25 best horror movies of all time as picked by the staff of IGN. This is not my pick. This is not my list. I am reacting to their list. A lot of the movies they include are films that I would include. Some of the ones they include are definitely not movies that I would include on the list. It excludes some movies that are personal favorites of mine. But as we go into this, the fun question is, with this list, which movie is the most egregious omission? What horror classic are you shocked that they did not include on this list? Likewise, what movie are you appalled that they did include on this list? And let's start fighting about the definition of horror. Which movie is a great movie that's on this list, but you do not consider it a horror film, thus it should not be on this list. If you like these type of videos, consider joining over on Patreon, where that's where my Patreons are the ones that are sending me the ideas and the articles to react to on these, and they are present live as we are going through these. Hi, patrons, these you guys are watching right now, and they're chiming in the chat with their own picks on some of these ones. If you like this sort of thing, want to join in on the fun, recommend articles, consider joining over on Patreon. Information is down below. So we got the 25 best horror movies of all time. I don't want to linger on this frame too much because I will get in trouble with copyright. We'll just scroll down and we will get started. Coming in at number 25, they have Scream. Other thing, as I go through this, what I'm going to say is, would I have it higher or lower on my list, or would I exclude it entirely? Scream is my favorite horror movie of all time. So me, I'm throwing this way easily into the top 10, top 5. If you're calling it favorite, it's number 1. If you're talking about best, that gets a little bit more complicated because objectivity comes into it. But I would certainly have Scream higher up on the list. I was born in 1981, therefore the Scream movies, the Kevin Williamson era of horror, that's the formative horror for me that shaped my taste, but they're both like, they work well as just slashers, they're whodunits, they're funny, they play with the genre, and all of them have fantastic casts, so I would bump that one higher up on the list because that one obviously means a whole lot to me. Number 24... we get to Nosferatu, the earliest film that is on this list, and a movie that I have not seen, because this is Nosferatu 1922, the one that came out 102.5 years ago, not the one that came out 2 months ago. I actually haven't seen it, so I can't comment on this one. But when you're talking about most influential, most important, stood the test of time, all that stuff, the ones that they have left ripples that are still out there. They remade this movie 2 months ago, and it made over $100 million. That's a movie that caused ripples and matters. So even as a movie that I have not seen, in terms of importance, impact, staying power, it makes sense to be here. 23, The Blair Witch Project. Once again, I was in high school in the 1990s. I remember when this came out and the Blair Witch craze. It was we were less sophisticated people at the time, so all they had to do was say at the beginning of the movie, based on a true story, and we were dumb enough to believe them. And so it was like, is this a real story? Like, they found some footage, and then like they turned it into a movie, and these people died. We were dumb enough that there was at least some of that was going on with this film. Now we know that found footage is just a genre. It's not a true statement. I'm a Blair Witch fan. I've never made a list of my top like 25 favorite best horror movies of all time. I'm not sure exactly where Blair Witch would appear. My gut feeling is to say maybe bump it up a little bit because I think it is one of the best and most effective found footage movies. Some of that is because it's one of the first ones that went so mainstream, or like the first one that went incredibly mainstream, and I was there for it. So I was there for the impact. If you watch it now after so many other movies, probably loses a lot of that flavor to it. But I think I would bump it up a little bit, I think. But, I think this is a relatively reasonable place to have it on the list. Number 22, Dracula 1931. I have seen this movie, but it was a very long time ago. I'm not someone that like grew up on those classic monster movies. That they weren't like formative films for me or anything like that. In fact, my main experience with them is I would go to the library and I would get the books on the making of the movies and the story about the movies. So like I read the behind the scenes and I read the story of them more than I actually watched the films themselves. So I can't chime in as much on specificity because it's been so long. But once again, back to the Nosferatu factor. When you're talking about movies that made a ripple, that stood the test of time, that were important, that were impactful, that were influential, these movies laid the foundation for the genre. So much so that we're still remaking them, we're still talking about them, all of that. So once again, the idea that this is in here, of course, this fits. We got 28 Days Later. This is one that I absolutely have seen multiple times. One of the movies that launched the early Zeros zombie revival that pretty well has kind of lasted for 20 years now, largely carried, on the backs of the Walking Dead. But, like in the 90s, there weren't zombie movies. Like zombies wasn't like a big genre in the 90s. And then 28 Days Later and several other things came out, and Land of the Dead, and that Dawn of the Dead remake. Suddenly the genre was brought back to life. And this is one of those films, kicked off the career of Cillian Murphy as this leading man. It led him being leading a $1 billion film, the R-rated film that also won him an Oscar. And so it's just like a great zombie film, so much so that once again we're getting a second sequel to it this year that is for a lot of people their most anticipated film of the year. So this is one absolutely I think fits on the list, and probably a good placement. Like I don't think it's like top 10, but absolutely one that is a good one. We're getting into another one of my blind spots. Somehow I have never seen The Fly. So I actually bumped into Jeff Goldblum just a couple weeks ago at the Critics' Choice Awards. When my wife and I were walking up to try and talk to the cast of Wicked, Ariana Grande was right in front of us, but the person she was talking to, they were crying, so we're like, we shouldn't interrupt this. And then we were told to go back to our seats, so I turned around, bumped into some guy, looked over, and it was The Fly right here. I've never seen it, though, so I can't comment on it, but when you talk about most iconic body horror of all time, when you think of like people are looking for a point of reference, even for The Substance, a movie that just came out, what's our point of reference? They go to The Fly, still almost 40 years later. An American Werewolf in London. I watched this for the first time just a couple years back, and I wasn't really sure what to expect. I had heard things about it, but I didn't really know the plot or really even the tone of the film. I knew this image very well, but so it was a pretty fresh viewing experience considering the film was over 40 years old and such an iconic classic. This might be the definitive horror film with the definitive werewolf transformation sequence in it, and managed to balance that horror and the comedy, the shock value, but also being able to make you laugh without undermining the tension. Another one that I don't know where I would put it on my list, but absolutely has a place in the top 25. Then we have Let the Right One In, and I'll say this, maybe it's because I watched this one as part of a 31 on 31, one of our big horror rankings, after having seen the remake of the film. It didn't have the impact for me that it had for a lot of other people. So for me, this, I didn't get it. Not, like, I didn't think it was bad. I just, the praise, top 25 horror movies of all time, I don't get it. I wouldn't include it in my list. I wouldn't think to include it besides the fact that other people do. So this to me would be one that I felt was overrated. Like just maybe I watched it in the wrong order, seeing the other one, watched it in a context where I was watching movies was a little bit of homework. And so it's not always the best context to experience a movie properly. But in either version of the film, I thought they were well made, but I didn't get kind of like best of all time, the themes, exploration, identity and relationships, codependence. Like I didn't get as much out of it as other people did. So I wouldn't include it in my top 25. Suspiria, once again, we got another one of my blind spots. I cannot comment on this one too much. I don't even have an anecdote to chime in on. This is one that I know very little. I don't even know the plot. I barely know. I know horror genre. That's all I really know about it, and they remade it a few years back. So this, to me, is a gigantic blind spot in my viewing experience. Then we have Dawn of the Dead, a movie I've seen many, many, many times, and right along with Night of the Living Dead, a film, not to spoil too much, that you will see later on this list, but those two movies invented the zombie genre. They created all of the tropes. Like, the first one invented it, this one expanded it and created like what everyone has been copying ever since, with, you know, post-apocalyptic, the downfall of society, that the ideas that, you know, the zombies are the bad guys, but sometimes the humans are the real monsters. The social commentary that runs throughout so many of these zombie movies, it all goes back to what George Romero did in 1978 and his commentary on consumerism, and that we're slaves and zombies to consumerism, and where would we go? We'd mindlessly wander to the malls. All of that is what everyone still keeps trying to explore in these same movies. Absolutely belongs on the list. Absolutely a legendary film. I'll chime in a little bit more on this when we get to another entry, not wanting to spoil too much, but definitely belongs on the list. I would have it higher on my list. A Nightmare on Elm Street, another one. This would be higher up on my list. Just a really great concept for a horror film and a slasher film. That our dreams are this time where we are so vulnerable. We have to sleep, and the idea that you can be killed in your sleep, right there is just a compelling concept that's terrifying. Add to that the idea of being killed in your dreams adds this element of creativity that, you know, so many slashers inherently in the genre, it's just, you know, stabbing people with whatever the blunt object or the sharp object of choice is for that particular slasher. Hey, we've got our knife hands in here, but more importantly, we're playing around with dream logic and stuff. And then kind of even beyond that, you've got a great cast in here, a young Johnny Depp, horror legend Wes Craven. So there's just so many levels on this one to where I would have this higher up on my list. Oh, and of course, and then Freddy Krueger is just a great character. Like a very fun character that's horrifying, and creepy at the same time, but can be funny. In this movie, can be funny without undermining the horror. That get lost in the sequels, but Nightmare on Elm Street, I think you got to move this one up on the list. Poltergeist. This is what I watched for the first time just a few years back. Despite being an 80s kid, despite being very much into these types of movies, I'd never seen it. So watching it for the first time 40 years after its release, it really holds up well. And it was a very fulfilling movie to watch for the first time, because it felt like discovering a long lost movie that it's like, how did I never seen this before? Which I already knew that, how I had never seen this before. That wasn't like a surprise revelation that I should have seen it before, but it really lived up to the hype of being, you know, kind of a classic. It's like the Spielberg movie that Spielberg technically didn't direct, though we don't know, you know, all the rumors of how involved was he with all of it. It lived up to all of that. Like it was interesting. The characters were compelling. It had that family vibe of so many of those Spielberg movies of the era, while having its own interesting horror dynamics to it. And I watched it with my daughter, who was much too young to watch it at the time, and I didn't get myself in trouble. So putting this above A Nightmare on Elm Street, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. I don't know that I put it I don't know that I have it this high, but this one absolutely lived up to the hype. Then we have The Thing, the John Carpenter classic. When I first watched this one 20 plus years ago, or over 20 years ago, it didn't click with me quite right at the time. And so I hadn't, it's not the John Carpenter movie that I'd explored as much. When I rewatched it a few years back for a video, it was like, oh, I'm an idiot. This is awesome. This is a great film. And I don't know how much of it is I'd watched the X-Files episode Ice which is very derivative of The Thing many times. And so maybe some of the freshness of The Thing kind of got lost on me whenever I watched it as a 19-year-old in the late 90s or whatever. But for me, the film, rewatching it, you just like tapped it like the real brilliance of a film. It is a creature feature. It has the iconic classic effects and creepy gore and all of that. But what really makes it work is just the paranoia that just leaves you on the edge of your seat. When you have the bursts of creature nastiness and everything, they're awesome, but you don't need that for the movie to work because you care about all the stuff in between just as much. So probably not a top 10 for me, but it's great. So 13, I think that's a really solid placement for this film. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, another one that was a first-time watch for me very recently when the 2022 film came out. And what's the absurdity of this is that I live right where this movie was shot. The road that they're driving down during the entire first half of this film is in front of my neighborhood. It runs all throughout the outskirts of the Austin area, and it runs right by my neighborhood. And whenever I'm driving to press screenings, I drive by right where the Texas Chainsaw Massacre house used to be. They moved it like 50 miles away, and they built apartments on top of it, which it's a block. It's like half a mile away from Dell headquarters. So this movie that represented middle of nowhere Texas now is like the center of suburbia. It's kind of interesting as it's disappeared from what it used to be, but I'm all around it. I grew up all around where this movie, very close to where this movie was shot, and live around where it was shot now, and only saw it recently. And another one that you kind of go into it like, will this thing hold up? Will it feel cheesy? Will it feel dated? And like, it is so unsettling and disturbing in ways that I was not expecting. Because I'm assuming just like slasher with the chainsaw, and Leatherface is very much kind of a side character. Like, Leatherface is the image that's iconic, but that's not so much of what makes the movie disturbing. And this dinner sequence that you're just sitting there, it's just like this stuff is casually happening, and you're, oh my goodness, this is so tense. Absolutely one of the best. I don't know where I put it on my list, but this feels like a very solid, reasonable placement for a movie that is still creepy, disturbing all these years later. Rosemary's Baby. Watched this one for the first time just last year, leading up to the release of Apartment 7A, the prequel to it. And one of the things that watching a lot of these classic horror films for the first time is that you realize just how disturbing these movies were without needing to use some of the shock tactics of today. Like, if you're just evaluating these movies on their gore compared to what we've seen in the, Terrifier and Saw, they can feel tame. But they have all of these other things that they're doing which are equally disturbing. Rosemary's Baby didn't hit me as much as some of the other ones. So I would have, is it a classic, iconic, important? Absolutely. I wouldn't have it this high, though. It didn't strike me as that. I wouldn't have it as high. And not to get too far ahead of myself of a movie that I don't believe is on this list, if I were to include a classic horror film relatively from the same era, I'd put The Omen. I don't think it's on the rest of this list. The Omen hit me. I was like, this is really cool. I liked The Omen more than this. Omen's about 10 years later, or 8 years later, but that's the one to me that worked a little bit better. But I get it too. Like, it worked in a lot of ways I was not expecting. It was creepy, disturbing in ways I wasn't expecting. So then, here's what I was referring to earlier. We move into the top 10. Night of the Living Dead, George Romero's film that essentially invented the zombie genre. I would put Dawn of the Dead over Night of the Living Dead. Maybe some of it is just pure aesthetic things of there's a bigger budget, it's in color, it's more of an action film, and there's just more to it. So it's just a little bit more to my flavor, and just the idea of being at a mall is more interesting, and the scope, size, world building on that one is just so much bigger on every single level. So it's more of my level, but also I think that it takes everything great about Night of the Living Dead and just builds everything on top of it. Just, okay, Night of the Living Dead, he cut the path so that you could really sprint down it with the next one. That's what I feel like Dawn of the Dead did. So I think it takes this great thing and does it just even better. But Night of the Living Dead is the movie, once again, that invented the genre, the tropes, all the classic things that everyone is still ripping off with the zombie genre, but also sometimes with the vampire genre, sometimes with the werewolf genre. They're still doing this kind of the world's falling apart, post-apocalyptic, we're holed up, and it goes back to what George Romero did with this film. So I would throw Dawn, I would swap Dawn in this one. That's what I would do. Number 9, love to see it, Evil Dead 2. This is one of my 10 favorite horror films of all time, so I'm all for it. One of the best horror comedies of all time, where Sam Raimi took the shock horror of the first film, added his love for the Three Stooges into the mix, and had a bigger budget, essentially remade and sequeled his own film all at once while shifting the genre just right. And just a more assured film on every level. This is my favorite of the Evil Dead films, and I'm surprised they have it in their top 10, but I have it in my top 10, so this is in the right spot. Love to see it. Bruce Campbell's absolute legend. So many little quirky little details about, cutting hands off and stuff that just that become iconic, and they're all from this film. Love to see it. Number 8. Here's where we start getting into some movies that no one debates are classic, but some people will debate whether they qualify for this list. Silence of the Lambs, absolutely fantastic film, won Best Picture. It's a serial killer film, but do serial killer thrillers count as horror films? I tend to be, let's have an open hand policy. Let's be very open in our understanding of horror. Why close it off? Why say, oh, well, this has these other things in it that I'm just not that person. I say, let's be very open on our definitions. So Silence of the Lambs, absolutely. Let's throw this in here in my mind. And it's a fantastic film. Absolutely belongs in the top 10. Hannibal Lecter's only in the movie for like 11 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that. And immediately became a part of the popular culture because it was that good. It's compelling. It's a great mystery. You love the interactions between all the characters. It's such a rich film that absolutely is one of the greats. Number 7, Jaws, another film that people go, is that a horror film? And it gets tricky because even if you read their definitions, reasons for why this is one of the best horror films, they list off a bunch of reasons for why it's a great film, but they don't describe all the reasons why it's great horror. Once again, I'm an open hand policy kind of guy, so I'm not going to fight it. If I was making my list of best horror movies, though, I probably wouldn't include it. Of movies on this list, is this one of the 10 best films on this list? Yeah. It's better than just number 7 if we're just saying best movies. It's tricky as soon as you say best horror, though, because it has horror, but is it a thriller? Is it where's that line between creature feature and horror? I don't know. That's why horror fans debate it to this day. So I don't think I would include this in a list of the best horror movies of all time. And some of that's because it is so celebrated. It's Spielberg that it doesn't need the acclaim of being on that list, where there's smaller films that aren't as recognized that can be, as soon as you take Jaws out, I can put that other film in. And that's a little bit where sometimes I come from on those perspectives, but I also don't like to be too much of a gatekeeper. But Jaws is a fantastic film for all the reasons everyone's been talking about. The fantastic characters, wonderful direction. It's thrilling. It can be fun. It can be horrifying. It's a movie that's not afraid to kill a kid. Like, Spielberg killed a kid. That's horrifying. And another one that people debate, does it qualify as a horror movie? Is it a sci-fi film with horror elements? Is it a haunted house movie in space? Without question, if we're just doing what are some of my favorite movies of all time, Jaws, Alien, Silence of the Lambs, all of them are on that list over films higher on this list. So just in terms of best movies, easily this would be in there. I adore Alien and Aliens. Both are A+ movies for me. I think this is a movie that puts you on the edge of your seat with horrifying things, so it does qualify as a horror film. And just incredible production design and creature design that, to this day, best alien design we've ever had in a movie. only competition is the Predator. But this is the one that is the most alien because it's not a humanoid standing. So adore the film. If I was once again making a list of my favorite horror films of all time or best horror films of all time, I probably wouldn't include Alien once again because it gets all the recognition in all these other categories. And so sometimes I'll go for, if I'm making that list, I'm thinking a purer version of horror. If you're talking about slasher movies, person running around with a knife killing people, pure horror, that's normally what I lean towards. So pure horror gets celebrated, where Alien obviously is sci-fi. But it's a franchise that holds up to this day, so I can exclude that movie that's already celebrated. I'm praising it everywhere else so that something else can be celebrated that's a purer version of the genre. But once again, I don't like to gatekeep. So if you're talking about what is the best movies that do qualify in horror, Alien absolutely fits that definition, so I don't want to argue with it too much. Number 5, Bride of Frankenstein. I'm not sure if I've seen this one. I've seen Frankenstein. I'm not sure if I've seen Bride of Frankenstein or if I just read the book on it back in the 90s as we talked about before. So I can't comment on this one too much. It's tough to chime, I have some knowledge base of it as a piece of film history. Once again, if you're talking about movies that just have that iconic imagery, you see that hair. Everybody knows that hair. Everybody knows what it represents. It has been parodied nonstop for now 90 years. And it has shaped the pop culture for 90 years. That matters. That is important. Top 5, I haven't seen it, so there absolutely is ignorance. So don't I'm fully aware of what I'm saying. That feels pretty shocking to have this high on the list. That feels pretty shocking to me. And whoa, that number 5, really? But I haven't seen it, so I can't chime in too much. Number 4, Halloween. No real surprise here that this is very high up on the list. Of course, possibly, depending on your definitions, the most celebrated slasher of all time. So, kicked off a franchise that's still a blockbuster franchise 45 years later. Kicked off the career of Jamie Lee Curtis, who's become one of, easily top 5 actresses, or most famous actresses, long-standing actresses of the last of 45 years. That, it's the movie that someone saw it and went, we need to rip that off, and that's how we got Friday the 13th. It's so influential, so popular, absolutely belongs on this list. This is, I would have it very high up on my list as well. Absolutely, no argument. Don't even need to explain why. Number 3, Psycho. Now, depending on your definition of slashers, perhaps this is the movie that kind of kicked off slashers, but didn't kick off the craze the way that Halloween did. Alfred Hitchcock, one of the most celebrated horror movies of all time. Once again, you talk about movies that are just iconic, from the score, shower sequence, the plot twist, the imagery of the hotel and the house and everything. Of course, Psycho is going to be extremely prominent on the list. Can't argue with it. I'm not a big Hitchcock person. It's not what I gravitate towards the most, so I can't put it in that category. But also, talking about those movies that make the ripples, that everybody understands, recognizes, of course, this movie belongs here. Our runner-up on the list, we have got The Exorcist. And once again, no argument here. Of course, the movie that was a massive hit, nominated for Best Picture, that kind of invented the possession genre as we know it, of course, is going to be very prominent on the list. It is a film that is still shocking to this day when you watch it. You're like, wow, they actually did this. They actually put that in. There's things in this movie where like, oh my goodness, I can't imagine them putting that in a movie now. This is horrifying. This is shocking. This is grotesque. And they did this over 50 years ago. So absolutely belongs very high on the list. It is a movie that has stood the test of time. It still works. 52 years later, it is the standard by which every possession movie, every movie like this, exorcism movie, is evaluated. And all of them struggle in comparison because it is the definitive one. No argument here. And this is the sort of reasoning where I go, like, you look at exorcism, of course this is going to be here. And you look at Psycho and you go, of course this is going to be here. And you go, Halloween, you go, of course this is going to be here. And then you go, Bride of Frankenstein. It's less of an of course. And anytime you're making a list like this, you want some flavor. You want something that's a little bit interesting. And so Bride of Frankenstein on this list, I feels like that's a little bit of their interesting for the top 5. Because you expect The Exorcist, Halloween, Psycho, as well as our number 1, The Shining. You don't necessarily expect Bride of Frankenstein to be a peer of these other 4 films. No surprise here that The Shining is in the top 5. This is, of course, one of the most celebrated horror films of all time. One of the most explored and dissected horror films of all time. But, as I've said many times before, Kubrick is not on my wavelength. There's so much in this movie I respect. It is not a top 10 for me. For me. Like, this is not me hating it. It's not me saying it's a bad movie. I just don't get a lot of it. It's just not on my wavelength. So when you guys are like praising all these details, I'm like, yeah, but there's some weird stuff like Halloran. Why does it build up him showing up all to have him killed off so quickly? I don't get it. There's a lot of that stuff in the movie that just the weird imagery, the like symbolism that just doesn't resonate with me at all. This is a good movie, fantastic performances, incredible design, camera work, all gotcha. But also even on the changes from, as someone that my dad drank himself to death and who I myself struggled with alcoholism for several years, that was kind of sidelined out of the story and some of the metaphors that King was working on in the book, that it's not in the movie. Like, that to me is a loss. And the ending is very anticlimactic, especially considering what Mr. King did at the end of the book. I actually like Dr. Sleep more. Quite a bit more. It just resonates with me on thematic levels as well as plot levels. It's almost like a superhero movie as a horror film. I like Mike Flanagan. Flanagan's more on my wavelength than Kubrick. But I get it. I understand. Like, I'm the outsider when it comes to my feelings on The Shining. Totally understand why it would be very prominent. But number 1 feels a little bit high to me. Now, as we look at this list, or look back over it, I asked you guys, what were the shocking kind of omissions let me know what you think of the shocking omissions. To me, No Omen. That to me is a classic. I watched it for the first time like 5 years ago, and it's like, this is a cool movie. Like, I'm really digging this. Surprise, no Get Out. Get Out wasn't included in there, and you don't really have. Let me check to see when this article was published. This article's 20 years old. You probably explain why Get Out isn't in here. Does it have a date for when it posted on the 24th of last year? So no, that's not their excuse. It is posted and was last updated last October. So pretty surprised that Get Out wasn't included in there. There's no A24. No kind of the elevated horror of the last decade. Sometimes I appreciate that because you need the passage of time to really see what is a classic. Like, what is really held up. Not just a flash in the pan, the movie we're talking about this year, but a movie that we're still talking about. Like I said, Nosferatu, Bride of Frankenstein, Dracula. We're still talking about them. We still know the imagery 80, 90 years later. That's a classic. And sometimes we have these movies that seem really big and they're not so big. But you look at some of the iconic franchises of the last 20 years, Saw, Conjuring, nothing. Child's Play, nothing. And that's kind of interesting. Like, is that the case? Should you boot out a Jaws or an Alien in order to kind of bring in these very iconic horror characters, or do you kind of say certain, I think this is true of a lot of horror franchises. The franchise is more iconic and better than any single film in the franchise. I think that's something that horror franchises run into a lot. That you can love this franchise and the set of characters, but if you stop and think, really, is there a movie in that franchise that deserves that spot in the top 25 over these other movies? Sometimes I think it gets a little bit trickier as soon as you do that. But people throwing in some of their picks for obvious omissions. It 2017, we didn't have the miniseries and we didn't have It. Very interesting omissions. This is another one. If we're going to throw Silence of the Lambs, but no 7, kind of interesting. CM Waters brings up Candyman. That was another first time watch for me when the new movie came out. Very, like, not at all what I was expecting it to be. Like, that was a movie that almost from the opening frame, as soon as the music kicked in, I was like, this is not the movie I was thinking that this was going to be. So another great one to throw in there. Michael throws in The Sixth Sense, a movie nominated for Best Picture. If we're throwing in Silence of the Lambs, Jaws, no Sixth Sense, a movie about somebody talking to ghosts and people getting killed in the mix. Certainly no way that could potentially be there. Hereditary, very celebrated film from recently. Showgirls. I caught that reference. Human Centipede, 50 Shades of Grey. And then Daniel Skinner throws in The Mist. I wouldn't throw Mist in there, but certainly a movie that made an impact. Those are the ones that immediately stuck out to me without stopping to think about it. It's like, really? None of these are in here? That's kind of interesting. Let me know your picks down below in the comments section. And keep talking movies and TV too much. Bye. And if you like these types of videos, I've been doing some of these article reactions over on my second channel, Sean Chandler Plus. You can check those out. Maybe I'll do a pinned comment with some of the other article reactions like this over.